Sorry, folks, here.
Here we go. Okay. So what is experimental photography? Well, this is the Experimental Photography Festival. So what is experimental photography? Well, there isn't any good definition of that. And it covers a lot of different, I guess, aesthetics or vibes or ilks that overlap and are different in various ways, but have things in common. And some of these names are analog photography, which is like, okay, let's shun everything that's digital. And alternative process, basically for a long time meant processes that did not use commercial photographic processes. This was a term even before digital, and it would refer to anything besides the standard commercial silver-based photography. And some other terms that people use now, sometimes lo-fi photography, a term I like, that we're going to try to make it low-tech in some way and not depend on high technology. DIY, that you make your own materials, your own photographic materials, or your own cameras, and new antiquarian. So there's a big emphasis on old processes from the very earliest days of photography. And then one thing that people don't talk about a whole lot in this whole experimental photography vibe is what I call accessibility. And that is the value of having processes that don't require a lot of money to do them, maybe don't require a lot of dedicated space and dedicated equipment. And so they're accessible in that way. And then also accessible in a way that they don't require the use of materials that are dangerous to your health or to the environment, perhaps. And materials that maybe you wouldn't want to use, and you would consider that I can't do that because I don't want to mess with that chemical. And all of these things partly get in each other's way a lot of times. You can't do all of this at once. And so there is no one umbrella that includes everything, but these are some of the strains that run through what the Experimental Photography Festival is all about. And it's a big umbrella that allows for many of these things. We'll see some examples. For example, the shun the digital thing, analog photography. Well, we'll see examples where the process is used as maybe something from the various earliest days from photography from 1840 or 1839, but uses it in a new way that includes some digital stuff. So we'll see lots of examples of that. So here's some basic examples of some of these things. Cyanotype. This is from 1842. John Herschel, astronomer, one of the founders of many different things in photography, invented this process. It's an iron-based photographic process. It's usually only used for printing. It's very low sensitivity. You print in sunlight or ultraviolet light in a UV box, and you can mix up your own light-sensitive material, and you brush it on typically a watercolor paper, but also cloth and a variety of other substrates too, and then it turns blue. It gives a negative blue image. And this is what I did some years ago, and the piece of paper was big enough that I had to do the processing in the bathtub. And it's origami. This is called Tree of Life, but just detail. Pinhole photography. So here, the lo-fi aspect, the idea that you can make your own camera with a box and a hole, and it's just the rules of geometry, no lens involved, just the rules of geometry that make the image. And so that's been a big appeal for this ilk of photography as well. In this case, the image was recorded with a piece of regular black and white photo paper like you would use to make a print from a negative in the darkroom, except I did what's called reversal processing on this, where I added in steps to make it come out as positive instead of a negative. And then when I processed this, I also used lo-fi lo-fi DIY kitchen chemistry. So the developer was made with coffee and instant coffee and vitamin C and washing soda. And the bleaching step was done with, instead of the usual ammonium dichromate, it was done with things that are much more benign than that. So pinhole photography and kitchen chemistry, that's another thing that's real popular in this solarography. This is something that really has only been a phenomenon in the last probably 10 years mostly, that it's really taken off. And it's used regular photo paper, but there's no processing at all done. It just turns dark on its own, but it takes forever. And the idea is you put a pinhole camera with photo paper in it, and maybe it exposes for months. And you get, the main thing that you get are tracks of the sun. So you get a record of the sun and the weather. This is just a test, so it's only for a week or so. But quite commonly people do these for maybe 6 months, and you see the seasons, a record of the weather. Every day as you get dotted lines as the sun's blocked and missing lines. And it's done with just a container, a hole, and some paper. But the reason this was not a thing until relatively recently is because what you do with the negative, you're done with it, you really kind of have to scan it and make a digital image from it. There's not a good way to capture that recorded image except digitally. So again, we're using something that's very low-fi and low-tech as far as the image capture, but it kind of requires digital technology. So we often have these kind of contradictions in here. Anthotype, this is becoming more and more popular. This is literally from the John Herschel again in 1842, same paper that he first talked about cyanotype. This is just the basic idea of something everybody knew, that vegetable dyes fade in the sunlight. I mean, in the textile industry, great expense and effort was made to come up with processes to make vegetable dyes that were inexpensive not fade in the sun. Well, okay, if you're thinking of a photographic mind like John Herschel, well, okay, put something there and allow light to selectively fade the dye. So this is actually turmeric extracted with alcohol and brushed onto a sheet of paper, and then leaves put on top of it, and then exposed in the sunlight for a couple of days. Actually, probably in this case, probably less than a day. Actually, most of a day probably, and then it's been darkened with washing soda. A slightly basic solution darkens turmeric. Actually got to help out a friend because she spilled turmeric on her carpet, and the carpet people could absolutely not get that stain out. And I lent her my short wavelength lights, and she, over a period of a week, faded the stain and it's invisible now. So Anthotype saves the day. Lumen, this is another one that could have been done a long time ago, but really it's only been a thing recently. And these are photographs that, again, is exposed with sunlight, really slow printing out, no developer used, just the paper does this with light over a long period of time. In the case on the left, then it was chemically fixed to make the image permanent. And that actually lost a lot of the detail. And you see in the center picture, that's what it looked like after the exposure. This is probably a day-long exposure. And the kicker is this is just using regular commercial photo paper that would have been used in the darkroom for making black and white prints from the negative, but using it in a totally different way. And then on the right is a digital scan of that with contrast enhanced. It makes a very different kind of picture in the end. So where do you sit on this? Experimental photography is often very process-oriented. So it's often very much not just about what you come up with, but how you did it. And it's also, there's a big strain of it that is very object-oriented. It's the photographic object in the end that's really important. It's a print made with platinum on a good mold watercolor, for example. So it has a kinship with traditional art printmaking in that way. But a lot of it doesn't go in that way and goes instead with the image as being the important thing over the actual physical object. And we can debate these things forever. Making your own cameras. So this is the plans. These are pictures from my book on lo-fi photography that's coming out hopefully by the end of the year. And so this is a camera meant for taking particular kinds of pictures, all made with PVC pipe and mat board. And it's not an easy thing to make, but it can be made without anything but simple hand tools. And it doesn't require any precise operations where everything has to be measured to within a tiny fraction of a millimeter, or it won't work. It has lots of play built into the design, so anybody who really takes the time, even if you're not all that crafty, could probably pull it off. There's an example of it sitting up here in the room if you want to look at it afterwards. So this DIY idea that you make your own cameras, or these are cameras for solargraphy, and there are a bunch of beer cans cut open, the paper's put inside, the pinholes are made separately on little sheet brass and taped to a hole. It's all put back together with foil, aluminum foil tape, weatherproof aluminum foil tape, and because it has to be not only light proof, it has to be waterproof and weatherproof. And then it's put up on a pole, and actually this is exposing right now, and it's been exposing since early January. And so each of these points in a different direction. People do this where they hide their little cameras all over the place, and then they try to find them afterwards and hopefully take good notes. If it takes 6 months for an exposure, you're probably going to start other exposures before you see what happens with that. So you cover your bases and make a lot of them, and so there's a little bit of element of like geocaching vibe to it. So what about the experimental parts? So those are kinds of things. Sometimes all this is looped under alternative processes or whatever. What about the specifically experimental part? So this is an example. My first foray into this back around 2000 or 1999. It came out of a project I was doing in collaboration with Judith Waller, emeritus professor of art here. And it was a astronomy art exhibit, and cyanotype seemed like an obvious thing to have as an element. Blue like the sky, it's sensitive to UV light, was invented by an astronomer. So we incorporated cyanotype, and I thought, what about taking cyanotype pictures with cyanotype in a camera? So I worked out the details of that, making long exposures with simple lenses. And this is one of my early examples from there. But the thing is, when we originally did this, they were negatives with a blue negative like cyanotype does. What I found was, and this was back in 2000, so this wasn't really so much of an obvious thing as it would be now, is I can scan that negative and digitally invert it to a positive, and I get this instead. And it's a compelling image in its own way that's very different from the vibe of cyanotype. First off, it's digital. That's like opposite of cyanotype, which is a nice piece of watercolor paper and hand brush sensitizer that you probably mixed up yourself on that piece of paper, and that's the thing on the wall. This is the digital image. So it kind of goes in another way. And it took a lot of experimentation to get this to work in a camera too. Another example, that's one of the things I will actually be presenting in Barcelona in July. This is another one. This is what I probably annoyingly call ephemeral process photography. There's that word process again, and everybody's got to like invent their own new name when they figure out some slightly different way of doing things, because we all experiment and we adapt techniques that we know and try to make something new out of them. So this is, it's a long story, but the lumen process where photo paper will just print out on its own with no developer. Well, I found you can brush out what I call an accelerator that makes that happen sometimes hundreds of times faster. And so you can, in effect, selectively pick what parts are really going to expose and what parts aren't. It gives a hand brush look. It also makes it sensitive enough to get a picture in the camera with it. And then after you wash all that off, it goes back to being really low sensitivity. You can capture the image with the visually with the scanner. And you get colors and all kinds of things. So this is another thing I'll be presenting. And this came about as I was trying to come up with something to teach in Scotland when I was going to teach in 2016. I was going to be teaching a photography class in Scotland, and I wanted to do my cyanotype in camera thing, but I was a little worried about not having the proper facilities to be able to even deal with cyanotype. So I tried this, and much to my surprise, it worked really well, and I've done a lot with it since. And then finally, this is a new process that I'll come back to that I came up with just a couple of years ago, actually just a few months before last year's, the call for invited artists for last year's experimental photo festival. And it's one of the things I put in my proposal. And this is a new process, as far as I know, that allows you to print with no water. It's all a dry process with powdered pigments. And that's an old thing too, except I'm doing them on UV polymer resin. It's been selectively exposed to light. And found a way to get a really nice range of tones. We'll come back to that. Okay, what about the festival? So this has been organized for the last 4 years. It's a nonprofit organization in Barcelona. And right here somewhere is Pablo and Laura. Right there is Pablo and Laura. They're the coordinators of it. And in the late in the year, they put out a call for invited artists and curators. And I answered that call in last year, well, in 2021, and was picked as one of the invited artists for 2022, and then again for this coming July. And so I encourage you to check out the website, experimentalphotofestival.com. And so here's what's up for 2023. And you can see why it's a festival, but it's also, as they call it, a summer camp. So it's the 19th to the 23rd, so it's 5 days. And there are 35 invited artists, projected 300 participants, dozens of volunteers. There will be 55 workshops. The workshops are each 4 hours long on doing different kinds of materials, all kinds of things. We'll come back to those in a bit. 16 conferences, and a conference is a 90-minute thing, kind of like this, except it's typically more like a panel with several people with kind of ideas that merge with each other, but maybe are different in various ways too. And they're on various assortment of topics. There are portfolio reviews, exhibitions going on during this time that are curated by invited curators. There are all kinds of other activities too, a film swap, film soup, all kinds of things going on. Swap table. And this all takes place in Barcelona in 3 spaces. Most of it is in the Civic Center that is right in the Gothic Quarter, and the others are just a half-hour metro ride away. And the city itself is an amazing place to be, and it's right in the thick of things. So it's a wonderful environment. A lot of the processes need sunlight, and so people are always running out onto the roof of the building or out onto the street to expose their various alchemical things they're doing in the workshops. The days are busy. So this is just a screenshot from a little piece of the draft schedule from last year. And you can see these are all simultaneous events all happening. The different colors are whether they're in English or Spanish. So some are in Spanish, some are in English. There's a few that are maybe in both, but most are in either English or Spanish. And it goes from 9 in the morning till sometimes 11 at night. There's stuff going on for 5 days. There are 35 of us, invited artists. I couldn't really put them all on here because they were long and skinny instead of sideways. So this is just a clip of them. There's me. Just some pictures from last year, a swap table. You can see it's a very festive kind of atmosphere. And I'll talk a little, this is one of the conferences. And in one of the workshops, I think this is probably Chemagram, but I'm not actually sure what they're doing there. So there are other places that do, say, workshops on photographic techniques, and then other ones that concentrate on alternative processes or these kinds of processes. A good example is the Penumbra Foundation in New York, runs a lot of workshops on various kinds of alternative processes. This is really different in a lot of ways. So you might go to the Penumbra Foundation, sign up for a workshop on the Mortensage process with Brittany Fletcher. It's because you know Brittany Fletcher's like really good at this, and you want to study that with her, and you'll pay money to do that. As well you should, because Brittany had to fly over from Scotland and she needs to pay the rent. So in that kind of environment, you're getting expert help from a master and spending time doing this workshop, and that's the point of going there. Well, the workshops here are a very big part of the Experimental Photo Festival, but it's not really the main point. And so there are some kind of stars at the festival, certainly not me, but last year I took a workshop on toning cyanotype with the net Golas, and we'll meet Annette a little bit later, but she wrote a book on that, literally. So, I mean, it doesn't get any better doing a workshop on cyanotype toning with the net Golas, but it's kind of the inception. And if you wanted to say, oh, okay, I want to go to the festival, but really all I want to do is do that one workshop with the net. Can I get a ticket just to do that one workshop and forget the rest of the 5 days, whatever else you folks are doing? Can I get a reduced price and just pay for that? And you can't, because we are all supposed to be experimenting and collaborating with each other and coming up with new ideas as part of the workshop. So the invited artists are also participants. So if you're an invited artist, it's not a way to make a living. They do what they can to make it so it doesn't cost you as much money as it might. But you certainly don't make money off of, nobody makes money off of working at the Experimental Photo Festival. On the other hand, it's very inexpensive to attend and be a part. It's like about $200 to be there for all 5 days and do one of the 4-hour workshops. And if you want a second 4-hour workshop, adds another $50 or something like that. And these workshops are with only 8 people, so they're very intimate and small. So it's much, much less expensive than going to Penumbra Foundation and doing a workshop with a recognized master there. And the idea is that we're all learning from each other, and the workshops are part of the way to do that. And so it's totally out of the spirit of the festival for someone to just come in, do a workshop, and leave. And that's why also part of the invited artist, part of our contract is that we get a free workshop. So we will be doing that. And we have the option, we get this to partly cover our expenses. We get some a very small housing allowance or a housing at the local university in dorms, basically. And we can instead take that cash and we could use the cash, or we could trade it in for more workshops if you had time to do them. But the idea is we're all working together and trying to come up with new ideas rather than going in and get your master workshop from some recognized master. So it really is a summer camp or a festival, and all of these things go together. The exhibitions, the workshops, the conferences, they're all part of the whole. These are some of their like principles, and they put this up for all the materials, that what they're trying to accomplish is working collaboratively, mixing techniques. So taking this one particular photographic techniques and mixing it with another, and that things can have some kind of a message and conceptual issues that are of interest to the community of experimental photographers. And also they strive for a diversity of participants, in particular the invited artists and the curators, etc. So here's an example. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this new resinotype process. First off, why is it called new resinotype? Well, I first called it resinotype last year. And turns out there was a process called resinotype that was done in Italy, very obscure and not done very often. It has some things in common, but it's also very different in many ways. So to avoid confusion with that, now I call it new resinotype. But for me, it's old resinotype from last year, now called new resinotype. And with this process, now first off, why did I come up with this in the first place? Well, I'm working on this book, Lo-Fi Photography, and it's not meant to be comprehensive, but it's supposed to look at processes that have this kind of elegance of simplicity to them. And there's one from early days of photography that is very elegant in a lot of ways. It's called gum bichromate. And you sensitize gum arabic, which is often used as a binder for watercolor. You sensitize it with a dichromate salt, potassium or ammonium dichromate. That makes it, under exposure to ultraviolet light, it will get hard and become insoluble in water, whereas unsensitized, it'll be soluble. So the idea is you mix this with watercolor pigment, and then you paint a piece of watercolor paper, and it's all, say, dark. Then you selectively expose it through a transparency or through objects, and then you gently wash it away, and the exposed parts don't wash away, and the unexposed parts do. And it's a way of making a print that is essentially a photographic watercolor. And furthermore, you can do multiple layers. And it's a process that has this simplicity, elegant simplicity to it. And it's pretty easy to do if you don't care whether or not it's a very good print. If you want it to be a good print, really good, it's really hard to do. It requires many layers, subtly building up contrast. It's very difficult to master to make really good prints. And people who have mastered it, they're just gorgeous prints that take a long time to do one of them. Furthermore, you can do multiple layers of different colors of pigment and do a color separation of a color image and do separate exposures for, say, cyan, magenta, and yellow, and do subtractive synthesis and make a full color picture. And that idea also, it's one of the early color printing processes, actually. And again, to do that well is really, really difficult. And I would just have talked about gum bichromate in my book, and just, okay, here's how you do it. It's simple, and it's hard to do a good print, but here's how you do it, at least a basic print, except for one kind of fatal flaw: the ammonium or potassium dichromate, which is an example of hexavalent chromium. And so if you want to maybe do this and also be able to look Aaron Brockovich in the eye, or maybe Julia Roberts even, then the hexavalent chromium is, and in fact, in many countries, you just can't even get it to do this process. You can here in the United States, but a lot of places it's hard to get. So I didn't want to do that in the book. So I was looking for an alternative that was in that kind of spirit and could do multi-layer printing, but didn't involve something nasty like this. This is back to that idea of accessibility, that it's not accessible to people who want to avoid that chemistry, who quite reasonably want to avoid that chemistry. So this is where I started experimenting with UV photopolymer resins. And these are resins that will harden like epoxy, but instead of a separate hardener that triggers that hardening process, it can be done with, they have special photoinitiators that will trigger that with ultraviolet light. And they're used in 3D printing. There's a particular kind of 3D printer that uses those resins. Those resins are not real nice. They're low viscosity, and they give off fumes in the printer. The liquid form of it is exposed for a long time. But there are thicker versions that are only meant for hardening little thin layers of things. And they're used in nail care salons. So that's a way to get your nails done. People who tie their own flies use this stuff a lot. Make little jewelry and trinkets. So this stuff is easily available, and it's relatively non-obnoxious, health-wise and environmentally, especially once it's hardened. And so the idea is I put a thin layer of this down on some stiff surface, and then, this was part of the secret, I have a special plastic that releases from this resin very easily. And I roll that out to make a smooth layer. So there's just a thin layer of this trapped under this plastic. Then you expose it to ultraviolet light selectively through objects, as in this case, or a transparency of some kind, a negative or a positive transparency. Then when you peel off the plastic, if it all works right, it might just look like nothing until you kind of hold it up to the light. You can sort of see a faint embossed image. And then what you do is you dust pigment on it, and you wipe it off, and it selectively sticks to wherever it was exposed the least. And this is just an example with some plants I put on there. On the top where I dusted a different color pigment on than on the leaves. You can selectively put different pigments in different places. So I came up with this because I wanted something that was more accessible than gum bichromate, but it was kind of in the same spirit. And it ended up being, I didn't think it would work very well, but it actually can work fantastic. It can work as both a negative or a positive. And this is with, on a black piece of black mat board. This is through a negative that I took with a homemade pinhole fisheye camera, which is another story, and on some funky ancient paper I bought off eBay, and it's really thin and exposed through that, and then dusted with, I think in this case, calcium carbonate, chalk basically, powdered chalk. The left there, that's done with charcoal. So charcoal sticks powdered up in a mortar and pestle and dusted on, and the feathers were just laid on top, exposed. Exposure times are just a couple of minutes in sunlight or UV light, and then dusted on, and you see you get a nice range of tones. It's not just dark or light, you get all the gray tones in between. And the objects can be quite pretty, they have a nice embossing. So I was very excited about this. And this is the same thing on the right, but done as a, if you do it with dark pigment on a white background, it comes out as a negative. If you do it with light pigment on a dark background, it comes out as a positive. I was very excited about this. It's one of the things I proposed to do a workshop on for the festival. And so this is another thing about how the festival's workshops are very different from the ones you might see at the Penumbra Foundation or the main photo show workshops or workshops in Montana or Stills Gallery in Scotland. These, if you look at the titles, a lot of them say, what even is that? Because they're strange experimental things and often mixing this with that. So they're not like platinum printing, or they're mostly idiosyncratic and quirky because they're trying to get you to think and come up with new ideas, more than to give you a master class in a tried and true technique that you can make expensive prints out for and sell. So anyways, I thought, okay, what about 3-color? Can I do this color synthesis with this? So this is 3 exposures, one on top of the other, with feathers. Feathers is just my go-to test thing. So I experiment so much, I rarely get time to actually make a picture that I want to hang on the wall. I'm usually taking test pictures out to the backyard. You wouldn't believe how many pictures of the backyard there are, and how many pictures of feathers, photograms of feathers, just because they're handy and give me an idea how things are working. But this is 3 layers with some pastels that Judith gave me. Basically, we're cyan, magenta, and yellow, the subtractive secondaries, and you put them in layers. So can you synthesize the subtractive primaries, red, blue, and green from those? And yeah, you're kind of getting, here's the magenta, where it overlaps the yellow, you see red, where the yellow overlaps the cyan, you see green, and and there's some blue in there. So I can see it kind of works, although this is just a crude attempt, and the yellow should be on the bottom because it's too opaque, etc. I thought, cool, there's really possibilities here that this could be done with 3-color, full color pictures from this by multiple exposure layers. Proof of concept. And so I go to the festival in 2022, and I take Annette's cyanotype toning workshop. And I had done cyanotype a lot over the years, and I had toned it with borax or some like basic thing everybody knows how to do, but I hadn't even really thought about it very much. So, which is embarrassing because I've been writing books on these things. And that very clearly explained how toning works, how it can change the color of the image without changing the color of the paper. That's kind of the basic idea. So the sort of chemistry behind that is how that can work. And that got me to thinking. And so I took this just to learn it, and because it was on net. And but it gave me ideas automatically. And that's how these things work. We share these things with each other, and then you get new ideas you never had before. And so way back, I was talking about it in 2000, I was doing those in-camera cyanotypes, which gives this blue and white negative on paper. And so the obvious thing is, can I take that negative and make a positive cyanotype from it? And for various reasons, that just doesn't work very well. And well, this toning opens up possibilities that maybe you could make that work. And so since then, I've been doing experiments trying to see if I can make a cyanotype positive directly from a cyanotype negative with toning. And I haven't succeeded, but it did lead to a lot of experimentation, and maybe I will get it. And that was actually Annette's idea, because in our discussions afterwards, she mentioned, oh, what about you toning? Well, yeah, I never thought of that. Anyways, Annette took my workshop on resinotype. And so I had a little bit of a body of test work that I brought with me, and before the workshop, I had been working with the process for about 9 months by that time. And so we do our workshop 4 hours long. I get everybody set up, and Annette's over in her corner making her little pictures. And look at them. And her first 2 pictures are better than anything I had made in 9 months. She came prepared because she is a master printer. She does a lot of printing and knows how to, she has done 3-color gum printing. And in fact, one of the innovations in her book is she figured out how to do 3-color printing with cyanotype by toning it. Doing a layer, the cyanotype gives you a blue layer, and then if you bleach it, you get a yellow, and if you tone it with madder root, you can get a kind of a reddish. And so by combining those 3 exposures, and somehow she figured out how to get them to not interfere with each other and kept them separate, she can make full color cyanotypes, which nobody had ever done before. And very time consuming process. But anyways, she had previously done 3-color printing with gum by chromate. She invented this 3-color cyanotype process, which she calls tricolor cyanotype, because she wanted to get away from hexavalent chromium, and she felt it was affecting her health. And so she experimented and invented this tricolor cyanotype process. So she was exactly the person who I needed to have in my workshop. And since then, she has gone like gangbusters with new resinotype. And she's now got it down. She can make beautiful, bright, full color with a beautiful range of full color gamut with only 3 layers, cyan, magenta, and yellow, all done with just kind of resin they use in nail salons and powdered pigments, and one in 3 layers. And this is an example of one of hers. And crucially, she gets a really nice black. And it's difficult to get a black out of just 3 colors. It's possible theoretically, but it usually doesn't happen. But it means you usually have to add more colors. So this kind of subtractive synthesis, an inkjet printer does something like that. It's a little more complicated, but it does something like that. Well, in theory, they could make a full color picture with just 3 colors, cyan, magenta, and yellow. They almost always add their own black as well. And most modern inkjet printers use at least 6 colors to get a nice range of tones. Well, she's getting something really, really nice with just 3 layers. Gum bichromate, it would typically take a dozen layers at least to get a nice color picture that had a nice range of tones. And this is another example of one of her pictures. These are pictures that she's, I believe, she has done them all 3 ways, these negatives. I think she took these with a digital camera with a pinhole instead of a lens, and that was I think a very early digital camera, very low resolution, and she makes these dreamy images out of them, and then does these amazing prints with them. First with gum bichromate, and then with her 3-color cyanotype, and now she's doing them with this new resinotype process. So I have high hopes that over the next couple of years, we'll be doing more experimentation. And Annette isn't the only one who was in that workshop who has done interesting things too. Miguel Aguilar was in there, and he's shown me some of his pictures he's done over the last year or two that are, some of those are really nice. So this is really the way I see the spirit of the experimental photo festival. You can't plan that these things will happen, but when you get us all there together in sunny Barcelona, with all that good food around everywhere, all you have to do is just walk out the door and trip over something and fall, and there'll be amazing food right there. And get us all there doing all this stuff from morning to night for 5 days. Something's bound to come out of it. So that's why it was a very rewarding experience for me to do that in last summer, and I can't wait to go back this summer. And so that's all I have. If there are any questions, I think if you're out there in Zoom land, our technology, the way it's set up, I don't think we have a way to hear you, but I think I can look at the chat if you put anything on the chat. But so let me put it back to here. Okay, so anybody have any questions? Yeah.
A few questions. The first one is on the pinhole camera.
Yeah.
I think it was the first one you showed the share, I think it was, or it was the solar one. The solar
With the streak of sunlight in it?
yeah.
That was a pinhole camera, yeah.
That one just saturated.
Pardon?
What do you find that one saturated? Just being light.
It's because you're using this photo paper that's yeah, I can't really go into this whole lumen process and solar dropping. You're using photo paper that was intended to be developed, and then a tiny exposure to light leads to a really strong image from the amplification you get by a chemical developer. In this case, we're not doing that. And so it's just the action of the light alone that causes it to turn dark. And also it's designed to do that poorly, actually, because when they design papers to be developed, they design them in a different way that makes them what we call printout with light alone very inefficient. So, so for a 6 months exposure, say, if you want lots of sun streaks showing the changes of the season in the altitude of the sun, then what you want is a tiny, tiny hole combined with extremely low sensitive material. And over that time, you typically get, depending on the paper, it will build up an exposure of the foreground as well. But the only thing that is bright enough to expose directly as it's moving is the sun itself. Yeah, Tom.
So when the exposure times are that long, how do you know when it's done?
You don't, and you can't predict except by experience. And in fact, one brand of paper compared to another will act totally differently, even if for their intended use in the darkroom, they might be almost indistinguishable. When you do this with them, it's completely different. And so just experience, word of mouth, other people telling, oh, use this paper, etc. And just trying it. That's why people who do this tend to make a lot of cameras and put them all over. And they always have new ones going out. They're always pulling out old ones that they've had out for a while. And then you kind of learn by experience, oh, I like the way this one paper acts. Some of them will solarize a little bit, they reverse on the highlights in a weird way. You get these strange colors. The whole color thing is another issue. Read my book if you want to get that. Yeah, okay, let me look on the chat here.
Maybe that's not just a
Q&A. Derry Berg, do you conduct any workshops in the US? Well, not as a normal, ordinary thing. I'm open to that, but I don't have a regular venue or anything like that. Greg, he's asking if I could talk a little bit more about my so-called ephemeral process. How long do the images last? Okay, so for what I was calling ephemeral process, I had that picture of a photogram of a butterfly. A photogram, by the way, is a shadow print, basically. Objects on the light sensitive material directly exposed through them. And the idea with that is, so I'm using that same paper that you would use for solargraphy or lumen process that's really designed not to print out well. Well, you could put something on it that will sort of get around that, and it will temporarily expose much, much faster, up to 1,000 times faster, only while this liquid is on it. So it has to be exposed wet. And I do that I brush on a layer of this, what I call accelerator, and I put a thin sheet of acetate on top. So it's like a sandwich, and I expose through the acetate, and it's exposed while it's wet. And then it's fast enough that I can get an exposure on a sunny day at f5.6 in about 10 minutes pretty easily, which is quite doable. It's still, you don't take snapshots, it's still time exposures, but daytime outdoor exposure is very doable. And then you take it out, you wash it off and dry it. So the only time you have to be careful with it is that little bit of time right after you put this accelerator on, and then get it in the camera, and then after you take it out. And the sensitivity then is much higher, but it's still low enough that you don't need a dark room. I typically do it under a big black sheet. And for that minute or so it takes me to get the paper accelerated and put it in a film holder of some kind, it doesn't significantly expose it. Then when it comes out of the camera, I go back under the sheet, take it out of the film holder, put it in a dark bag. Then later, when I get home, I go in a dim room. Doesn't have to be a dark room, just a dim room, wash it off and dry it. And then I have this funky negative. The negative really can't be made permanent very easily. If you try to, you lose a lot. So the process of fixing it to make it permanent destroys a lot of the image. And so I don't. I leave it sensitive to light. And so these negatives have to be kept in the dark, and they are just stored, but the sensitivity is low enough that you can capture the image digitally. And I usually do that with a high resolution scanner, just a regular flatbed scanner, and I scan them. And most of the time I can scan even at high resolution, and I have maybe one shot at it before the scanner destroys the negative. Because as it's being scanned, it's exposing it and it's turning dark. Not nearly as sensitive as it was when it was in the camera because it doesn't have this accelerator on it, but it does destroy it. And in some cases it does, it depends on lots of details. So the negatives are just stored, and if I got a good scan the first time, I never even need to go back to them. But this is not a good way to get, so again, this is extremely analog. You see the details of how you brush this accelerator on. It's a very physical, visceral kind of an image capture. But the only thing you can really do with it is make a digital image out of it in the end. There are ways to fix it and some ways around that, but anything that you try in that way, going in that route, inevitably leads to a loss of detail, and especially color. So yeah, I have this very physical, extremely simple, lo-fi image capture process, but that needs to use digital image capture in order to actually make a picture and digital printing. So this weird thing. And I just made my peace with that. It's not what I only do, but it's one of the things I do. And when I do it, I make my peace with that kind of dichotomy between those ideas.
You have another question.
Yeah, let me see here. Oh, classic. Hi, Goal. How big have I made resinotypes? Goal, I've only been doing very small ones, up a little bit bigger than 8 by 10 inch, 20 by 24 is about the biggest I've done. One of the limiting factors is you need the special kind of plastic that you roll the resin underneath this sheet of clear plastic. And what works really well for that is something called FEP, and it's made for the 3D printing industry. And it's literally designed to transmit ultraviolet light and to release from cured UV polymer resin. So it works perfect, but that stuff isn't real inexpensive, and it's hard to find it in large continuous pieces because it's usually made pre-cut for 3D printers, which don't make huge models. So I don't have any sheets that are big enough to do anything bigger than about an 8 by 10 at the moment. And I like it as a small print process. It could be made big, but I'm still experimenting and don't have like a system completely down. And so I haven't ventured into anything bigger than 8 by 10. And I usually work with my test prints are typically 4 by 5 or 5 by 7. Also, you have to be able to roll this out evenly, and it gets harder the bigger it is. Your surface needs to be nice and stiff and flat for that rolling process. And that, of course, gets harder the bigger it is. But it could be done big. I think Annette's only been working with little ones too so far. Any other questions? Okay, well, I guess this was fun, and I guess we're pretty much right where I was supposed to be ending, and I have a class to teach pretty soon. So if there are no more questions, then thanks for stopping in and hanging out with me for an hour.